Now, last week we saw that job order costing is when you're focusing on a particular job that a lot of it is not produced. It's not produced in large quantities or in large batches. Like, for example, an airplane is not produced in the same amount of batches as you would produce cereal, which is more in a continuous process flow. So we're going to be distinguishing the job order costing and the process costing. Now think about these processes as a snowball. You know, you're trying to get a snowball and you're going to throw it at a snowman. As you throw the snowball and the snowball begins to roll, it starts to pick up more snow, and as it picks up more snow, it starts getting larger and larger. So that's exactly what happens to costs. You know, you think of the snowball, as the snowball rolls and it picks up more snow, you start picking up costs in your product. That's actually the same way that it's going to work. So through your readings, through viewing the video lecture, through your successful response to the discussion exercises, and through the successful completion of your assignment, you're going to be able to fulfill the weekly objectives for for week number 3. And you're going to be able to distinguish between the flow of costs in process costing and in job costing. You're going to describe the key characteristics and graphs of various cost behaviors. You're going to use the high-low method to analyze cost behavior, and you're going to use cost equations to express and predict costs. So again, remember, try to draw a visual picture of the flow of costs and how it relates to process costing. And remember that it's like rolling a snowball into a snowman. You know, the product, which is going to be the snowball, is going to start picking up more and more snow. So that's like the product picking up more and more costs, and as the product successfully progresses through each department, the costs keep getting larger and larger. So you can call this, the snowball technique. And of course, when you distinguish between the flow of cost in process costing and in job costing, you got to remember that in job costing you have unique goods. They're smaller batches, and service companies normally use the job costing. And in week 3, your week 3 assignment dealt a lot with you being able to identify different companies and then able to classify whether they use a job costing or a process costing. And remember, for process costing, usually those are large quantities of identical units, and you got jelly beans and gasoline. Now, conversion cost, companies that use automated production processes typically use 2 cost categories: direct materials and conversion costs. And when we look at conversion cost, it's direct labor plus the manufacturing overhead. Now, how do you compute equivalent units? So companies that have a work in process inventory, they express the amount of work done in terms of fully completed units of outputs. So we look at the number of physical units times the percentage of completion. So let's look at an example. Let's say that we have 5,000 units, 80% complete, with costs incurred evenly throughout the process. Okay, so if you have 5,000 units and 80% of them are complete with costs incurred evenly throughout the process, that means that you would multiply the 5,000 times the completion, the 80%, so that means you have 4,000 equivalent units. Now, in the inventory flow assumptions, process costing uses either a weighted average method or a first in, first out method. And you defer only in treatment of beginning inventory. From a cost-benefit standpoint, most firms use weighted average cost for simplicity. First in, first out method is more complicated. And this is not something that you're going to get really, really deep into, but what's important for you to understand is that the weighted average is the one used for cost simplicity. In inventory methods, a weighted average is usually a blend of a first in, first out inventory and a last in, first out inventory. And usually it gives, a good outcome for the goals that companies want to meet. If they want to maintain, like, if they want to show steady results through net income and through profits and through the overall financial sustainability, to use a weighted method. Because what happens with the first in first out and the last in first out is that they some tend to show higher or lower net incomes using one method versus the other. So if you use process costing in the first production department, how does process costing work? Well, if you use the weighted average method, you're going to summarize the flow of physical units. So what are the flow of physical units that are going to transpire? Compute the output in terms of equivalent units. Summarize total costs to account for it, and compute the cost per equivalent unit, and assign total cost to units completed and to units ending in the work in process inventory. So in summarizing the flow of physical units, which would be the step one, you would see that that your beginning work in process for the previous month is you wouldn't have any flow of physical units. So if you started production in this particular month, your total physical units to account for would be 50,000 physical units. If you completed and transferred out during October, plus your ending work in process on October 31st, let's say you completed and you transferred 40,000, that means that you ended your work in October 31st with 10,000, and the total physical units that you can account for are for 50,000. And then you would have to then, in step two, determine how much of that were direct materials and how much of that were in conversion costs. The other aspect that you have to think about between job costing and process costing is that when you have direct material and you have direct labor, it is in the process where you have to make that transformation of the product when you're getting the raw materials, and you have the we can call them the intermediaries that help put the product together before it goes to finished goods. Where the major difference between the two process are is in that transformation process, in that middle layer where it goes into work in process before going into finished goods. Okay, if you get an average cost of one completely shaped unit, let's say that it's $4.40, and then you have a total average of 176,000 divided by 40,000 units. The sum of the direct material cost per equivalent unit plus the conversion cost per equivalent unit is going to be the numbers that you're going to be working with. When we focus on sustainability and process costing, it's conducive to employing lean practices which eliminate economic waste. So lean practices eliminate economic waste, green practices minimize and they eliminate harmful environmental consequences. And of course, you want to do any trash audits or waste audits to also, determine your sustainability. And then you want to definitely focus on the journal entries for process costing and job costing. Once you have your ending results from the ledgers, you want to process the costing journal entries. So, for example, if during a particular month, let's say that in October, 140,000 of direct material was requisitioned for use by the shaping department, well, what's going to happen? You're going to debit work in process and you're going to credit the raw materials inventory, because what happened is that the material that you had that is in inventory as an asset, that just went into the work in process. So that is credited. You can no longer show that you have that asset in there. So then you debit a work in process inventory, which is the shaping aspect of it, and so forth. So, and then the same thing if you have to pay anyone for that work in process in the shaping department, you're going to debit work in process inventory and you're going to credit the wages payable, because it's a liability. You're going to pay the wages in the future. Also, manufacturing overhead, per machine hour and how much the department used, that's going to be credited. Manufacturing overhead is going to be credited. So, um, so the materials, and remember that the materials inventory, the wages payable, and the manufacturing overhead they all get credited to work in process. Now, when you use process costing in a second or later production department, that is, that is something to focus on as well. You must split the total cost among, the amount of jobs completed and transferred out, and then you also must split the cost of the partially complete, jobs that are in work in process. So you definitely want to look at, at chapter 5 and focus on the specific steps to complete. You have to look at the completed and transferred out, the partially complete, and the totals. And that should give you a good foundation for the activities that need to be done in week 3. So I will go over the assignments that you have in week 3, and you're going to have the discussion questions, and you're going to distinguish between the flow of costs in process costing and job costing, and explain why some cost equations are useful to express and predict costs. Well, excellent. You know how to distinguish between the flow of cost in process costing and job costing. And then you can, continue to read in chapter 5 and look how those equations play a role in the flow of cost and process costing and job costing. Now, you have to remember that you have to use a lot of critical thinking when you're putting your response together, because, the objective of the course is not for you to become like expert managerial accountants, but for you to be able to make the managerial decisions that involve, how can I reduce my cost? Does that entail me buying from, purchasing from a supplier that has lower cost? Or, does it involve, the direct labor? Does it involve the manufacturing overhead? Do I need to add steps to the process? Do I need to eliminate steps in the process? Do I need to combine steps in the process? Because ultimately what you want to do is you want to optimize operations. That's why the flow of costs, regardless of what company it is and whether you use process costing or job costing, and that's not determined by the company, that's actually determined by the actual product. There's a big difference between an airplane and cereal. So you have the week discussion question covered. The second discussion question is explain how process costing is used in the first production department. Well, we saw how process costing, functions in the first production department and the activities that are going to transpire and work in process and finished goods and so forth. And your discussion number 3 is how is process costing used in a second or later production department? So compare and contrast those activities that transpire in a first department versus those that, transpire in a second department. And then you're going to have a scenario of Pez Candy Inc. that they produce a small popular candy that is dispensed in collectible flip-top dispensers. And in the United States, Pez candies are produced in a factory in Connecticut, and over 3 billion of the small brick-shaped candies are consumed in the US each year. So at this point, in your week 1 exercise, we were able to identify the companies and whether they use as a process costing or they use a job costing. So as you're reading this case about Pez candy, you're going to write, off the bat, be able to determine whether you're using process costing or job costing. And then in a 1,200-word essay format, you're going to synthesize the concepts from this week's readings as you respond to the following. So is Pez Candy going to be more likely to use job costing or process costing for the manufacture of its Pez candies? If not, explain why or why not. Well, you have a foundation to be able to respond to this. Provide an example of each of the following types of costs that Pez Candy Inc. would be likely to incur in the manufacture of its Pez candies. And of course, what are going to be examples of each of the following types of costs? Well, you have direct material, direct labor, factory overhead, indirect materials, indirect labor, and other manufacturing overhead. And explain whether pest candy is going to be more likely to use the job costing or process costing to calculate the cost of one birthday party hosted at the Pest Visitor Center. Again, here's where you got to apply the critical thinking, your analytical skills, and not only think outside the box, but think beyond the box. And explain whether you can use any graphical illustrations to exemplify the outcomes in this scenario. And what you can do in this part of the scenario, your book is going to have some illustrations of graphs, similar to the graphs that you've probably seen in statistics and in economics, where you have the volume, the volume of the production, the volume of products that you're producing, and you have the number of guests and how much they're buying at. And as the volume increases, the production costs start going up, they start shifting. So look at those graphs and then look at the information in pest candies, and based on their overall process, you can add a graph where you can discuss, how the graph would shift in this particular scenario. So I hope that you enjoyed the video lecture, and I wish you good luck in week 3 and your week 3 assignments. I will be available inside the online classroom if you need any additional assistance or you need to ask me any additional questions. Thank you and good luck.